May 1953, Willowbrook, a canal town in the heart of England. On a warm Saturday morning in May 1953, when the hawthorn blossoms hung heavy in the air and the Queen's coronation was still fresh in every mind, 17-year-old Margaret Maggie Hartwell stepped out of her family's terraced house on Elm Street, unaware that she was walking into a mystery that would haunt Willowbrook forever. The morning mist clung to the canal like ghostly fingers, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled 9 times, marking what would be the last morning of innocence in this sleepy industrial town. The camera of fate seemed to follow Maggie as she adjusted her powder blue cardigan and checked her reflection in the front window. Her auburn hair caught the filtered sunlight, and her green eyes sparkled with the kind of youthful anticipation that belongs only to Saturday mornings when the whole world feels possible. Behind the lace curtains, her mother Florence was already busy with the weekly wash, the sound of scrubbing echoing through the narrow hallway like a domestic rhythm that had played unchanged for generations. "I'm off to meet Penny," Maggie called through the door, her voice carrying the musical quality that had made her the star of the church choir. "We're going to look at the shops in town, then maybe walk by the canal." Florence Hartwell paused in her scrubbing, soap suds dripping from her reddened hands. Something, a mother's intuition perhaps, or merely the residual anxiety that had plagued all parents since the war, made her hesitate. Through the window she watched her daughter's figure growing smaller as Maggie walked briskly down Elm Street, her heels clicking against the cobblestones with determined purpose. "Be back by tea time," Florence called, but Maggie was already too far away to hear, her silhouette disappearing around the corner where Elm Street met the main road that led to the town center. 3 streets away, in a slightly more affluent neighborhood where the houses boasted small front gardens and painted gates, 16-year-old Penelope Penny Morrison was experiencing her own moment of departure. Unlike Maggie's working-class household, the Morrison home buzzed with the kind of restrained prosperity that came from her father's position as assistant manager at the local textile mill. The wireless crackled softly in the parlor, broadcasting news about the new Queen's upcoming tour of the Commonwealth, while the scent of bacon and eggs lingered pleasantly in the air. Penny stood before the hallway mirror, applying a careful touch of lipstick, Revlon's Fire and Ice, borrowed secretly from her older sister's dressing table. Her dark hair was perfectly victory-rolled, a style she'd practiced for hours in admiration of the movie stars whose photographs she collected in a hidden shoebox under her bed. At 16, Penny possessed the kind of sophisticated beauty that made older boys stammer and younger girls stare with undisguised envy. "You look lovely, dear," said her mother, Eleanor Morrison, appearing in the doorway with a teacup in hand. Eleanor had the refined bearing of a woman who had married slightly above her station and never quite forgotten the effort it required. But perhaps a bit less rouge. "You don't want people to think—" "Oh, Mother," Penny interrupted with good-natured exasperation. "It's 1953, not 1853. Besides, I'm only going shopping with Maggie." Eleanor's expression softened at the mention of Maggie Hartwell. Despite the difference in their social standings, she approved of the friendship between her daughter and the girl from Elm Street. Maggie was a good influence, studious, well-mannered, and refreshingly free of the wild streak that seemed to be afflicting so many young people in these changing times. "Very well," Eleanor conceded. "But remember what your father always says about the Canal path. It's not a proper place for young ladies, especially with all those rough men working the barges." Penny kissed her mother's cheek, leaving a faint trace of lipstick that Eleanor would discover hours later and treasure as the last physical reminder of her daughter's presence. "Don't worry, Mother. We'll stay in town where it's crowded and safe." The irony of those words would echo through the investigation that followed, because less than 20 minutes later, both girls would be walking exactly where they had promised not to go, along the towpath that ran beside the Willowbrook Canal, where the water moved slow and dark between banks lined with drooping willows and the occasional rotting barge moored like a sleeping monster. The town center of Willowbrook bustled with its typical Saturday energy. Market stalls lined the cobblestone square, their canvas awnings fluttering in the gentle breeze. Mrs. Henderson sold fresh flowers from her corner stand, their colors bright against the gray stone of the surrounding buildings. The smell of fresh bread wafted from Pemberton's bakery, mixing with the more industrial scents that always hung in the air: coal smoke, machine oil, and the ever-present damp mustiness of the canal. Maggie and Penny met at their usual spot, the ornate Victorian fountain in the center of the square, where a bronze angel held an eternal vigil over the market crowds. They embraced with the easy affection of best friends, their different social backgrounds forgotten in the universal language of teenage friendship. "Did you bring your ration book?" Penny asked, her eyes bright with conspiracy. "I heard Mrs. Whitmore at the sweet shop got in some chocolate from London." Maggie patted her handbag, a modest affair of brown leather that had seen better days. "Of course, though I'm not sure Mother will be pleased if I spend all my pocket money on sweets again." They spent the morning as they had planned, wandering through the shops that lined Market Street. They fingered fabrics they couldn't afford at Thornton's Drapers, admired the new summer hats in Millicent's Millinery, and finally succumbed to temptation at Whitmore's sweet shop, where they pooled their money to buy a small bag of wrapped caramels. It was nearly noon when they found themselves at the eastern edge of town, where Market Street dead-ended at the Canal Bridge. The ancient stone structure spanned the dark water like a medieval gateway, its weathered arches framing views of the towpath that stretched away in both directions like a ribbon of beaten earth. "Shall we?" Penny asked, gesturing toward the path with the kind of casual rebellion that makes adults worry. "Just for a bit? The sun's so lovely and I'm tired of being indoors." Maggie hesitated, remembering her mother's warnings and Penny's promise to Eleanor Morrison. But the afternoon was warm. The path looked peaceful enough, and at 17 she possessed that particular brand of invincibility that belongs exclusively to the young. "Just to the first lock," she agreed. "We can sit on the bench there and eat our sweets, then come straight back." They descended the worn stone steps that led from the bridge to the towpath, their heels clicking against the ancient masonry. The sound of the town began to fade behind them, replaced by the gentle lapping of water against the canal banks and the distant hum of insects in the tall grass. The towpath stretched ahead of them, sun-dappled and seemingly innocent, bordered on one side by the dark water and on the other by a thick hedge that separated the walkway from the farmland beyond. What neither girl noticed was the figure that had been watching them from the shadows of the bridge's eastern arch. Someone who had seen them descend to the towpath and now began to follow at a careful distance, keeping to the tree line where the dappled sunlight provided perfect camouflage. The lock that marked their intended destination lay perhaps half a mile along the path, where the canal stepped down to accommodate the gentle slope of the countryside. It was a peaceful spot, popular with courting couples and families on weekend outings. An old wooden bench sat beside the lockkeeper's cottage, though the cottage itself had been abandoned for nearly a decade, its windows boarded up and its garden overgrown with brambles. Maggie and Penny walked at a leisurely pace, their conversation floating on the warm air like music. They talked about the usual concerns of teenage girls, the dance plan for next weekend at the church hall, the new boy who had started working at Morrison's mill, and kept finding excuses to walk past the office where Penny helped her father with filling on weekends, and their shared dreams of life beyond Willowbrook's narrow boundaries. "Sometimes I think about London," Penny confided, unwrapping one of their precious caramels. "Or even America. Can you imagine? All those shops and restaurants and theaters. And all those people," Maggie added with a small shudder. "I think I'd rather stay somewhere where everyone knows everyone, where you can walk down the street and feel safe." The irony of her words, spoken on what would be their last walk together, would haunt the investigation that followed. They reached the lock just as the church bells in town began to chime noon. The abandoned cottage squatted beside the water like a sleeping toad, its boarded windows giving it a blind, malevolent appearance, but the bench remained in good repair, positioned to take advantage of the view back toward town, where the church spire rose above the rooftops like a protective finger pointing toward heaven. Perfect, Penny declared, settling onto the bench and patting the space beside her. We can see anyone coming from either direction. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, sharing their sweets and watching a pair of swans glide across the water with ethereal grace. The sun climbed higher, warming their faces and making them drowsy with contentment. It was the kind of perfect moment that exists suspended in time, unmarked by any sense of impending doom. It was Maggie who first noticed the man approaching from the direction of town. "Someone's coming," she said quietly, though there was nothing immediately alarming about the figure walking toward them along the towpath. He appeared to be middle-aged, well-dressed in the manner of a gentleman, wearing a dark coat despite the warmth of the day and carrying what looked like a walking stick or umbrella. "Probably just someone out for a constitutional," Penny replied, though she too had begun to watch the approaching figure with growing unease. There was something in his gait too purposeful for a casual stroll, too focused for someone simply enjoying the afternoon air. As he drew closer, they could see more details. He was indeed well-dressed, perhaps in his 40s, with dark hair slicked back with pomade and a mustache that gave him an almost theatrical appearance. His clothes were expensive but somehow wrong for a country walk. A wool overcoat more suited to winter weather, and leather shoes that would be ruined by a trek along the muddy towpath. "Good afternoon, young ladies," he called when he was still some distance away, his voice carrying clearly across the water. "Lovely day for a walk, isn't it?" His accent was refined, perhaps London or Birmingham, certainly not local. Penny and Maggie exchanged glances, both thinking the same thing. What was a gentleman like this doing, walking alone along a rural towpath on a Saturday afternoon? "Good afternoon," Maggie replied politely, her mother's teachings about proper behavior toward one's elders overriding her growing sense of unease. The man continued his approach, and as he drew nearer, they could see that what they had taken for a walking stick was actually something else entirely, a leather case or satchel of some kind, carried like a briefcase but longer and thinner. "I don't suppose either of you young ladies has seen a dog come this way?" he asked, stopping perhaps 10 feet from their bench. "A small terrier, brown and white. He slipped his lead back in town, and I've been following his tracks along the path." It was a perfectly reasonable story, the kind of innocent mishap that happened every day. But something about the way he told it, the slight delay before speaking, the way his eyes moved between their faces as if measuring their reactions, made both girls shift uncomfortably on the bench. "I'm sorry, we haven't seen any dogs," Penny said, her voice carefully polite. "But then, we've only been here a few minutes." "Ah, well," the man said, and now they could see that he was sweating slightly despite the cool air near the water. "Perhaps he's gone further along the path. Tell me, do either of you know how far this walkway extends? I'm not familiar with the area, you see. It goes all the way to Little Marshfield." Maggie answered automatically. "About 5 miles. 5 miles, the man repeated thoughtfully. "Quite a walk for a small dog. I do hope he hasn't fallen into the water." There was something in the way he said this last sentence that made both girls stand up simultaneously, an instinctive response to a threat they couldn't quite identify. The man noticed their movement and smiled, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. "Well," Penny said brightly, with the kind of forced cheer that indicates barely controlled panic, "we should be getting back to town. Our mothers will be expecting us for dinner." "Of course," the man agreed readily. "Young ladies shouldn't be walking alone so far from civilization. There are all sorts of dangers along these old paths." He stepped aside to let them pass, a gesture of apparent courtesy that somehow felt more like positioning. As they walked past him, both girls felt the weight of his gaze and quickened their pace without discussing it. They had walked perhaps 50 yards back toward town, when Penny glanced over her shoulder and stopped so suddenly that Maggie nearly collided with her. "He's following us," Penny whispered, her face pale beneath her carefully applied rouge. Maggie turned to look and saw that Penny was right. The man had abandoned any pretense of searching for a lost dog and was walking deliberately in their direction. his strange case swinging at his side with each step. "We should run," Maggie said. But even as the words left her mouth, she could see another figure approaching from the direction of town. A second man, this one younger and dressed like a laborer, walking toward them along the same narrow path. They were trapped between the two men on an isolated stretch of towpath, with the dark water on one side and an impenetrable hedge on the other. The abandoned lockkeeper's cottage sat behind them like a silent witness, its boarded windows offering no hope of sanctuary. "The cottage," Penny said suddenly. "There might be a way through the garden, around to the other side." Without waiting for Maggie's response, she grabbed her friend's hand and pulled her toward the overgrown garden that surrounded the abandoned building. They crashed through the brambles, their stockings catching on thorns and their carefully styled hair becoming disheveled as they fought their way through the undergrowth. Behind them, they could hear the sound of pursuit, footsteps on the towpath, voices calling out in urgent conference. The two men had clearly been working together, their chance encounter a carefully orchestrated trap. The cottage garden was a maze of overgrown rose bushes and collapsed trellises, with paths that led nowhere and clearings that offered only dead ends. In their panic, the girls became separated, each fighting her own way through the thorny wilderness while the sounds of their pursuers grew closer. Maggie found herself against the back wall of the cottage, her hands bleeding from the thorns and her breath coming in desperate gasps. She could hear Penny somewhere to her left, crashing through the undergrowth with the same desperate urgency, and over it all she could hear the voices of the men, calm and methodical as they coordinated their approach. "This way," one of them called. "They can't have gone far." "Check the cottage," replied the other. "I'll circle around." Maggie pressed herself against the stone wall of the building, trying to make herself invisible among the shadows of the overhanging eaves. Through a gap in the brambles she could see one of the men, the younger one, moving systematically through the garden, pushing aside branches and peering into every potential hiding place. A scream pierced the afternoon air, sharp and desperate and unmistakably Penny's voice. It was followed by the sound of a struggle, thrashing in the undergrowth, and then a silence so complete it seemed to swallow the world. Maggie clamped her hand over her mouth to stifle her own cry of terror. Every instinct told her to run to her friend's aid, but her rational mind understood that she would only be walking into the same trap. Instead, she pressed closer to the wall, making herself as small as possible, while her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird. Footsteps approached her hiding place, slow and deliberate. Through the leaves she could see polished leather shoes picking their way carefully through the debris of the garden. The well-dressed man from the towpath was searching for her, moving with the patience of someone who knew his prey had nowhere to run. "Come now, my dear." His voice drifted through the brambles, cultured and reasonable as if he were coaxing a frightened cat from under a bed. "There's no point in hiding. Your friend is quite safe, I assure you. We merely want to have a conversation." The lie was so obvious, so insulting to her intelligence, that Maggie felt a surge of anger cut through her terror. She had heard Penny's scream, had heard the struggle that followed. Whatever had happened to her friend, it was not quite safe. The footsteps paused directly in front of her hiding place. Through the screen of leaves, she could see the man's face as he bent to peer into the shadows where she crouched. His eyes were pale blue, almost colorless, and they held an expression of mild amusement, as if this were all a rather entertaining game. "I can see you there, you know," he said, conversationally, behind the rosebush. Quite a thorough hiding place, but not quite thorough enough. Maggie closed her eyes and prayed silently, the words of the Lord's Prayer running through her mind like a protective charm. When she opened them again, the man was reaching through the brambles toward her, his hand extended like a spider's leg emerging from its web. In that moment of absolute terror, some primitive survival instinct took control. Maggie burst from her hiding place like a startled rabbit, crashing through the remaining brambles with a desperation that gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. Thorns tore at her clothes and skin, but she felt nothing except the overwhelming need to reach the towpath, to run toward town, to find help before it was too late. She emerged from the garden at its far corner, bleeding and disheveled but momentarily free. The towpath stretched before her like a promise of salvation, and she ran with the speed of absolute terror, her heels striking the beaten earth with a rhythm like machine gun fire. Behind her she could hear shouts and the sound of pursuit, but she didn't dare look back. The church spire in the distance became her beacon, her fixed point of hope in a world that had suddenly turned malevolent. If she could just reach the bridge, reach the market square, reach the safety of witnesses and helping hands. She was perhaps halfway to the bridge when the weakness hit her legs like a physical blow. The adrenaline that had carried her from the cottage garden was failing, and her desperate sprint slowed to a stumbling trot, then to a walk, then to a swaying struggle to remain upright. Something was wrong with her vision. The towpath seemed to blur and shift, and the church spire that had been her guiding star began to waver like a mirage. She tried to call for help, but her voice emerged as barely a whisper, thin and ineffective against the vast indifference of the countryside. A hand fell gently on her shoulder, and she turned to see the well-dressed man standing beside her. His pale eyes filled with what might have been sympathy. He was no longer pursuing her. He had simply walked up behind her as she stumbled along the path, as if he had known that her flight would end exactly here. "There's a good girl," he said softly, his voice seeming to come from very far away. "No more running now. Everything is going to be quite all right." Maggie tried to push him away, but her arms felt like lead weights. The world was spinning slowly around her, the colors bleeding together like watercolors in the rain. She realized, with the clarity that sometimes comes in moments of crisis, that something had been done to her, some drug or poison that was stealing her strength and consciousness. The last thing she saw before the darkness claimed her was the man's face, professional and businesslike as he caught her falling body and lifted her with surprising ease. And beyond him, approaching along the towpath with unhurried steps, the younger man carried what looked like a bundle of cloth over his shoulder. But Maggie's fading consciousness refused to accept what her eyes were telling her about the shape and size of that bundle, about the way one pale hand dangled limp and lifeless against the man's back, about the dark stain that was spreading slowly across the fabric that might once have been a powder blue cardigan. As consciousness slipped away entirely, her last coherent thought was a prayer that someone would find them, that someone would know to look, that someone would care enough to search the shadows along the towpath where two teenage girls had vanished on a warm Saturday afternoon in May. The church bells in Willowbrook were chiming 3 o'clock when the men disappeared into the countryside beyond the canal, leaving behind only silence and the gentle lapping of dark water against the muddy banks. On the abandoned bench beside the lock, a small paper bag of caramels sat forgotten in the afternoon sun, its contents slowly melting in the heat while a pair of swans glided past with serene indifference to the evil that had visited their peaceful domain. By evening, when neither girl had returned home for tea, the search would begin. But by then, the towpath would hold only questions, and the answers would be hidden in shadows that seemed to grow darker with each passing hour, as if the very earth along the canal had absorbed something that would never again allow the sunlight to fall quite the same way. The mystery of Margaret Hartwell and Penelope Morrison had begun, and somewhere in the gathering dusk, two families were about to discover that their worst nightmares were not nightmares at all, but the beginning of a waking horror that would consume their lives and haunt their community for decades to come. The first sign that something had gone terribly wrong came at 6:30 that evening, when the shadows were growing long across Elm Street and the smell of Sunday roast preparations drifted from kitchen windows throughout Willowbrook. Florence Hartwell stood at her front door, her hands still damp from preparing the vegetables, peering down the empty street with the kind of maternal anxiety that had been sharpening all afternoon like a blade against a whetstone. Maggie was never late for tea. In 17 years of life, through childhood illnesses and adolescent rebellions, through the darkest days of the war when routine was the only thing that kept families sane, Margaret Hartwell had never once failed to appear at the dinner table without prior arrangement. It was a reliability so absolute that Florence had built her entire domestic schedule around it, as predictable as the church bells that marked the hours. The camera of consequence seemed to linger on Florence's worried face as she stepped out onto the narrow pavement, her house slippers clicking against the worn stone. Other mothers were calling their children in from their Saturday adventures, voices echoing off the terraced houses, doors slamming with the comfortable finality of families gathering for the evening meal. But there was no answering call from Maggie, no familiar click of heels approaching down the street. "She'll be along any moment," Florence murmured to herself, the words carrying less conviction each time she repeated them. "Just lost track of time, that's all. Girls do that when they're shopping." But even as she spoke, some deeper instinct was already whispering that this was different. This was wrong. 3 streets away, in the Morrison household where the wireless was broadcasting the evening news and the smell of lamb and mint sauce filled the air, Eleanor Morrison was experiencing her own moment of growing unease. The grandfather clock in the hallway had just chimed 7, and Penny's place at the dining table remained conspicuously empty, her carefully set place setting a monument to absence. "Perhaps she's lost track of time," offered Harold Morrison, Penny's father, though his words carried the hollow quality of a man trying to convince himself as much as his wife. Harold was a methodical person, a man who had built his career on schedules and systems, and his daughter's unexplained absence violated every principle of order that governed his world. Eleanor moved to the front window, her reflection ghost-like in the darkening glass. "She promised to be back by 6, she said quietly. "She's never broken a promise before." The telephone in the Morrison hallway, one of the few private lines in their neighborhood, suddenly seemed to loom with ominous possibility. Eleanor found herself staring at it, willing it to ring with some innocent explanation. A friend's party that had run late, a chance encounter that had led to an impromptu invitation to someone's house for tea. But the telephone remained silent, its black bakelite surface reflecting the light from the hallway lamp like a dead eye. It was Harold who finally broke the paralysis of waiting. "I'll walk into town," he announced, reaching for his coat with the decisive movements of a man forcing himself into action. "Check the shops, ask around. Probably just met up with some friends and forgot the time." But even Harold, for all his determination to find a rational explanation, felt the cold touch of premonition as he stepped out into the evening air. Willowbrook was not a large town, and on a Saturday evening, anyone abroad would be easily spotted. The market square would be winding down, the shops closing, the public houses beginning to fill with their regular clientele. If Penny and her friend were anywhere in town, someone would have seen them. The search began in fragments, uncoordinated and born of parental instinct rather than any systematic plan. Harold Morrison walked briskly through the town center, stopping at every open shop to inquire about 2 teenage girls, his description of his daughter becoming more detailed and desperate with each negative response. Meanwhile, Florence Hartwell had swallowed her pride and knocked on the door of her neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, whose grandson worked at the railway station and might have seen the girls boarding a train to somewhere else. By 8 o'clock, as the last light was fading from the western sky, the 2 separate searches had inevitably converged. Harold Morrison found himself standing outside the Hartwell house on Elm Street, his face grave with the realization that whatever had happened to the girls, they had disappeared together. Florence opened the door before he could knock, her face already telling the story of her own fruitless search. "You haven't found them either," she said, and it was a statement rather than a question. "No," Harold admitted, removing his hat in a gesture of defeated courtesy. "I've been through the entire town center. No one's seen them since this morning." They stood in awkward silence for a moment, 2 parents from different social spheres, united by a terror that transcended class distinctions. In the distance, the evening shift whistle at the textile mill echoed across the town like a funeral dirge, marking the end of the working day and the beginning of something far more sinister. "We should call the police." Eleanor Morrison's voice drifted from behind her husband. and when Florence looked past Harold, she could see the other woman standing in the doorway, her face pale with a control that seemed held in place by sheer willpower. "Police," Florence repeated, and the word seemed to hang in the air like a curse. "But surely, I mean, they're not just anything," Eleanor said quietly, stepping forward to stand beside her husband. "Something has happened to our daughters, Mrs. Hartwell. And whatever it is, we're not going to find them by walking the streets and hoping for the best." The Willowbrook police station occupied a Victorian building on High Street, its red brick facade and tall windows giving it the appearance of a school or municipal office rather than the seat of law enforcement. Inside, the evening duty officer, Sergeant William Blackwood, was settling in for what he had expected to be a quiet Saturday night, perhaps a drunk or two to process. Maybe a domestic disturbance if the public houses got too boisterous. The arrival of the Morrison and Hartwell families changed everything. Sergeant Blackwood was a veteran of 23 years on the force, a man who had seen enough of human nature to recognize genuine terror when it walked through his door. The four parents standing before his desk, Harold Morrison in his pressed suit, Eleanor with her careful composure beginning to crack, Florence Hartwell with her work-roughened hands twisted together in anxiety, and Florence's husband James, who had been hastily summoned from his evening shift at the brewery, represented a tableau of middle-class nightmare that no amount of police experience could make routine. "Now then," Blackwood said, his voice carrying the kind of professional calm that was meant to be reassuring, but somehow only emphasized the gravity of the situation. "Let's start from the beginning. When did you last see your daughters?" The story emerged in fragments, each parent contributing details while the others listened with the intensity of people passing a sacred text. Maggie leaving home at 9 that morning, cheerful and ordinary. Penny's careful preparation, her promise to stay in town, her mother's specific warnings about the Canal path, their plan to meet at the fountain, to shop, to return by tea time, and they were definitely together? Blackwood asked, making careful notes in his ledger with a fountain pen that scratched against the paper like a desperate whisper. "Oh yes," Eleanor confirmed. "They've been inseparable since they met at the church social last autumn. Thick as thieves, they are." "Where?" The correction hung in the air like a slip of the tongue that revealed too much. Blackwood consulted the large clock on the station wall, its brass pendulum marking the passage of time with mechanical indifference. "It's now nearly 9 o'clock. That means they've been missing for approximately 12 hours, assuming they disappeared sometime around noon." 12 hours, Harold repeated, and the number seemed to take on weight as he spoke it, becoming less a measurement of time than a quantification of terror. "I'll need to organize a search," Blackwood continued, reaching for the telephone that connected him to the regional headquarters in Coventry. "But I have to tell you honestly, the first 24 hours are critical in cases like this. After that," he didn't finish the sentence, but the implications hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle. Everyone in the room understood what came after 24 hours, the transition from missing persons to something far darker, from hope to the kind of preparations that no parent should ever have to make. The search began at first light Sunday morning, as the church bells across Willowbrook called the faithful to morning service, and most of the town's residents were still deciding between staying in bed and fulfilling their religious obligations. But for the 30 volunteers who had gathered in the market square, Sunday morning brought not worship but the grim duty of combing every inch of countryside for signs of 2 missing girls. Detective Inspector Thomas Whitmore had arrived from Coventry on the early train, a lean man in his 40s with prematurely grey hair and eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail of the world around him. Whitmore had built his reputation on cases that other officers preferred to avoid, the complicated ones, the ones that required patience and psychological insight rather than brute force and obvious clues. Right then Whitmore addressed the assembled volunteers, his voice carrying clearly across the cobblestone square. "We're looking for any sign of Miss Margaret Hartwell and Miss Penelope Morrison, last seen yesterday morning. They're 17 and 16 respectively. and according to their families, they planned to spend the day shopping in town. He paused to study the faces before him, shopkeepers and mill workers, farmers and clerks, united by the particular horror that strikes small communities when their children disappear. Will work in teams of 3, each covering a designated area. Look for anything, clothing, personal items, any sign of disturbance. And remember, if you find something, don't touch it. Mark the location and fetch me immediately. The search teams spread out across Willowbrook like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. Some headed toward the railway station and the roads leading out of town. Others focused on the industrial areas where abandoned buildings might conceal evidence or worse. But it was inevitable that one team would eventually make their way to the Canal Towpath, to the peaceful stretch of water where Saturday shoppers sometimes walked to escape the bustle of the market square. It was nearly noon when young Timothy Fletcher, a baker's apprentice with sharp eyes and nervous energy, called out from his position along the towpath near the abandoned lock. His voice carried across the water with an urgency that made every member of the search party stop what they were doing and turn toward the sound. "Inspector, over here. I've found something." Whitmore reached the lock within minutes, his long strides eating up the distance along the towpath, while the other searchers converged from their various positions. What Timothy had discovered lay on the wooden bench beside the lockkeeper's cottage, incongruous and heartbreaking in its ordinariness. A small paper bag, twisted shut at the top, its contents partially melted and sticky. Caramels, from the look of them, the kind that young people bought with their pocket money for special treats. The bag bore the unmistakable mark of Whitmore's sweet shop, and when Whitmore opened it carefully with his handkerchief, the smell of sugar and vanilla rose into the morning air like a ghost of happier times. "This could be nothing," he said aloud, though every instinct told him otherwise. "Could belong to anyone." But even as he spoke, one of the other searchers was calling out from the overgrown garden behind the cottage. "Inspector, there's been a disturbance here. Looks like someone's crashed through the brambles." The evidence was unmistakable once you knew how to read it. Broken branches hanging at unnatural angles, scraps of fabric caught on thorns, and in one particularly muddy spot near the cottage wall, the clear impression of a woman's shoe, small, with a distinctive heel pattern that spoke of youth and careful attention to fashion. "Fetch the photographer," Whitmore instructed one of the constables, "and send word to Coventry. I want the forensics team down here this afternoon. This is now officially a crime scene." As the official machinery of investigation began to grind into motion, Whitmore stood alone beside the bench where the bag of sweets had been found, trying to reconstruct the events of Saturday afternoon. 2 girls walking along the towpath, despite their promises to stay in town, a peaceful spot beside the lock, perfect for sharing sweets and teenage confidences. And then something had gone wrong terribly, violently wrong. But what, and more importantly, the afternoon brought revelations that only deepened the mystery. The forensics team from Coventry, armed with cameras and evidence bags and the latest scientific techniques, transformed the peaceful lock into a tableau of official investigation. Every broken branch was photographed, every scrap of fabric carefully catalogued, every footprint measured and recorded. It was Detective Sergeant Patricia Moore, one of the few women on the regional force and an expert in crimes against persons, who made the discovery that changed everything. Working methodically through the cottage garden with a magnifying glass and endless patience, she found what everyone else had missed. A single drop of blood on a thorn near the cottage wall, dried to a dark brown but unmistakably recent. "Inspector," she called, her voice carefully controlled. "You need to see this." Whitmore crouched beside her, studying the tiny stain that seemed so insignificant and yet spoke volumes about what had happened in this garden. "How recent?" he asked. "Within the last day or 2, Moore replied. "The weather's been dry, so it's well preserved." "But Inspector," she paused, studying something else she had found. "There's more. Look at this." In the soft earth near the blood-stained thorn, she had uncovered something that made Whitmore's stomach clench with foreboding. A button, small and delicate, made of mother-of-pearl with a pattern of tiny flowers around the rim. The kind of button that would be found on a good cardigan, the sort that a 17-year-old girl might wear on a special shopping trip to town. "Bag it," Whitmore said quietly, "and expand the search area. If there's one button, there might be more." But as the afternoon wore on and the search area grew wider, it became clear that the cottage garden had yielded all its secrets. Whatever had happened to Margaret Hartwell and Penelope Morrison, it had begun here but not ended here. They had been taken somewhere else. But where? The answer to that question would prove more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. As evening approached and the search teams began to disperse, Whitmore found himself standing once again beside the lock, watching the dark water flow slowly past the cottage. Something about the scene nagged at him, some detail that his subconscious had registered, but his rational mind hadn't yet processed. It was the swans that finally gave him the clue he needed. Throughout the day, he had noticed them gliding back and forth across the water, beautiful and serene as always. But now, in the fading light, he realized that their movements weren't random. They were avoiding something, a particular stretch of water near the far bank, where the current created a small eddy behind a fallen tree branch. "Sergeant Moore," he called. "I need a boat and diving equipment." "Sir?" Moore looked puzzled. "You think they might be in the water?" "I think," Whitmore said slowly, his eyes fixed on the dark surface of the canal, "that we're not looking for missing persons anymore. I think we're looking for bodies." The diving operation began at first light Monday morning, as the news of the girl's disappearance spread through Willowbrook like wildfire and gathered crowds along the canal banks. Professional police divers from Birmingham had arrived overnight equipped with the latest underwater search equipment and the grim expertise that came from too many similar operations. The first body was found within an hour. She floated just below the surface in the eddy that Whitmore had identified, her pale face turned upward toward the morning sky like a tragic angel seeking redemption. Margaret Hartwell, 17 years old, still wearing the powder blue cardigan she had chosen so carefully for her Saturday shopping trip. The cardigan that was now missing one small mother-of-pearl button. The second body proved more elusive, and it wasn't until late Monday afternoon that the divers finally located Penelope Morrison in the deeper water near the lock gates, where the current had carried her away from her friend. She lay tangled in the rusted chains of the lock mechanism, her dark hair floating around her face like seaweed, her victory rolls long since dissolved by the dark water. Both girls had been strangled. The post-mortem examinations, conducted by the county pathologist in the sterile confines of Coventry General Hospital, revealed details that turned the investigation from a missing persons case into something far more sinister. Both girls had been sexually assaulted before their deaths. Both had been drugged, chloral hydrate, administered in some sweet substance that had masked the bitter taste. And both had fought desperately for their lives, their fingernails containing traces of skin and blood that belonged to their attackers. "Attackers," Whitmore repeated when the pathologist's report reached his desk Tuesday morning. "Plural. You're certain?" "Absolutely," confirmed Dr. Elizabeth Thornbury, the pathologist whose 20 years of experience had taught her to read the stories that dead bodies told. The bruising patterns, the nature of the assault, the way the bodies were disposed of. This was the work of at least 2 men, possibly more. Whitmore studied the photographs spread across his desk, clinical black and white images that reduced 2 vibrant young lives to evidence in a criminal case. The investigation had become personal for him, as these cases always did, and he found himself thinking about his own daughter safely away at university in London, protected by distance and circumstance from the kind of evil that had visited Willowbrook. "What about the drug?" he asked. "Chloral hydrate isn't something you can buy at the local chemist." "No," Dr. Thornbury agreed. "It's a controlled substance, used primarily in hospitals and veterinary practices. Whoever did this had access to medical supplies, or knew someone who did." The revelation opened new avenues of investigation, And by Wednesday morning, Whitmore had teams of officers checking every hospital, veterinary clinic, and medical practice within a 50-mile radius of Willowbrook. The list of people with legitimate access to chloral hydrate was surprisingly long, but it was a start. It was Detective Sergeant Moore who made the connection that would crack the case wide open. Working late Wednesday evening in the temporary incident room that had been established in Willowbrook's town hall, she was cross-referencing the medical access list with the growing file of witness statements, when she noticed something that made her pause. "Inspector," she said, her voice tight with excitement. "Look at this." She had pulled two documents from the file, a witness statement from Mrs. Henderson, the flower seller in the market square, and a personnel record from Coventry General Hospital. Miss Henderson mentioned seeing a well-dressed man in the market square Saturday morning. Someone she didn't recognize, said he was asking directions to the Canal Towpath. "I remember," Whitmore said, "but she couldn't give us much of a description." "No, but she remembered something else. He had a medical bag with him, one of those black leather cases that doctors carry. And look at this." She placed the hospital record beside the witness statement. Dr. Marcus Pemberton, consultant psychiatrist at Coventry General, reported his medical bag stolen from his motor car Friday night. Contents included surgical instruments and various medications, including chloral hydrate. Whitmore finished, leaning forward with sudden intensity. "Where is Dr. Pemberton now?" "That's just it," Moore said. "He's vanished. Didn't report for work Monday morning, and his landlady says he cleared out of his lodgings over the weekend. Left no forwarding address." The hunt for Dr. Marcus Pemberton began immediately, but it quickly became clear that the man had planned his disappearance carefully. His bank account had been emptied Friday afternoon, his motor car found abandoned in Birmingham, his few personal possessions either taken or destroyed. It was as if he had deliberately erased himself from existence, leaving behind only the growing evidence of his crimes. But Whitmore knew that no one could disappear completely. Not in post-war Britain, where rationing books and identity cards created a paper trail for every citizen. Someone, somewhere, would have seen Pemberton after his disappearance. Someone would know where he had gone. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a railway porter at Birmingham New Street Station, who remembered selling a ticket to London to a well-dressed gentleman Saturday afternoon. Someone who seemed nervous and kept checking the station clock as if afraid of being followed. "Gave me the creeps," he did. The porter told Whitmore during their interview Thursday morning. Kept asking about the next train to Dover, like he was planning to catch the ferry to France. But then he bought a ticket to London instead, said he'd changed his mind. Dover. The ferry to France. Whitmore felt the familiar chill that came with realizing how close a criminal had come to escaping justice entirely. If Pemberton had made it to the continent, they might never have found him. But London was different. London had records, witnesses, a police force that knew how to track a man through the vast anonymity of the capital. And if Pemberton was still in England, still trying to blend into the crowds of post-war Britain, then sooner or later he would make a mistake. The manhunt was about to begin in earnest. But even as Whitmore prepared to travel to London, even as the wheels of justice began to turn with their grinding inevitability, there remained one question that haunted him as he stood once again beside the dark waters of the Willowbrook Canal. If Dr. Pemberton was one of the killers, who was the other man? The pathologist had been certain. This was the work of at least two people, and possibly more, which meant that somewhere, perhaps still in Willowbrook itself, there was another monster walking free among the shocked and grieving community. Someone who had helped lure two innocent girls to their deaths. Someone who had participated in unspeakable acts of violence. Someone who was now watching the investigation unfold and congratulating himself on his escape from justice. Someone who might already be planning his next move. The London fog of Friday morning hung thick and yellow over the Thames as Detective Inspector Whitmore stepped off the early train at Paddington Station, his breath visible in the chill air despite the approaching summer. The great city sprawled before him like a labyrinth where a single man could disappear among 8 million souls. But Whitmore had learned that even in the vastness of London, evil left traces for those who knew how to look. The Metropolitan Police had been cooperative but pessimistic. Dr. Marcus Pemberton could be anywhere from Whitechapel to Westminster. Chief Inspector Davies had told him during their brief meeting at Scotland Yard, if he's got money and half a brain, he's probably already on a ship to the continent. We see it all the time with men running from their pasts. But Whitmore had not survived 20 years in criminal investigation by accepting defeat easily. Something about Pemberton's profile suggested a man who was methodical rather than impulsive, organized rather than desperate. Such men made plans, established bolt holes, created identities that could sustain them for months or even years. They didn't simply run blindly toward the nearest port. What about medical connections? Whitmore had asked. Other hospitals, private practices, anyone who might harbor a colleague. Davies had shrugged with the weary resignation of a man who had seen too many criminals slip through the net. We're checking, of course. But London has hundreds of medical facilities. Could take weeks to cover them all thoroughly. Weeks they didn't have. Every hour that passed made Pemberton harder to find. And more importantly, it left the second killer in Willowbrook free to strike again, or disappear entirely. The thought of that unknown accomplice walking among the grieving families of his victims filled Whitmore with a cold rage that had sustained him through the sleepless nights since the girls' bodies were found. It was Detective Sergeant Moore, calling from Willowbrook with her characteristic precision, who provided the breakthrough that changed everything. "Inspector," her voice crackled through the long-distance telephone line as Whitmore sat in the cramped office that the Metropolitan Police had provided for his use. "I've been going through Pemberton's employment records again, looking for London connections. He worked at St. Bartholomew's Hospital for 3 years before coming to Coventry, and I've found something interesting." Whitmore leaned forward, pressing the receiver closer to his ear. "Go on." He was dismissed from Bart's in 1950 for inappropriate conduct with female patients. "The records are sealed, but I managed to speak with one of the senior nurses who was there at the time. She remembers Pemberton being involved with another doctor in whatever happened, someone who wasn't dismissed, but transferred quietly to another position. Do you have a name?" "Dr. James Ashworth, and Inspector. He's currently working at the Royal London Hospital in Whitechapel, night shift in the emergency department." Whitmore felt the familiar electric thrill that came with pieces of a puzzle suddenly clicking into place. "Moore, you're brilliant. Send word to the Yard immediately. I want surveillance on this Ashworth character within the hour." But even as he spoke, Whitmore realized that the revelation raised as many questions as it answered. If Pemberton had an accomplice in London, someone with medical training and a history of misconduct with female patients, then the Willowbrook murders might not be an isolated incident. They might be dealing with predators who had been hunting together for years. The Royal London Hospital squatted like a Victorian fortress in the heart of Whitechapel, its sooty brick walls and tall windows overlooking streets that still whispered with memories of Jack the Ripper's reign of terror 60 years earlier. As Whitmore approached the staff entrance with 2 Metropolitan Police constables, he couldn't help but reflect on the irony. Another monster stalking women in the very neighborhood where the world's most notorious killer had once prowled. Dr. James Ashworth was exactly what Whitmore had expected. A thin, nervous man in his 40s, with prematurely grey hair and the kind of pale, indoor complexion that spoke of too many night shifts and too little sunlight. He looked up from the medical chart he was studying as the 3 policemen entered the emergency department's break room, and Whitmore saw recognition flicker in the man's eyes before he could conceal it. "Dr. Ashworth?" Whitmore showed his warrant card with the practiced efficiency of someone who had made 1,000 such introductions. "Detective Inspector Whitmore, Coventry Police. I'd like to ask you a few questions about a former colleague of yours, Dr. Marcus Pemberton." The reaction was immediate and unmistakable. Ashworth's face went pale, the medical chart fluttering from his suddenly nerveless fingers to scatter across the floor. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the distant murmur of hospital activity and the steady tick of the wall clock marking the passage of what might be Ashworth's last moments as a free man. "I don't know what you mean," Ashworth stammered, but his voice carried no conviction. "Marcus and I worked together at Bart's years ago, but we haven't kept in touch." Whitmore studied the man with the cold patience of a hunter who knows his prey is cornered. "That's interesting, Doctor, because we have reason to believe that you and Dr. Pemberton were together in Willowbrook last Saturday afternoon. 2 young girls were murdered there, and we have evidence linking both of you to their deaths." It was a bluff, but an educated one. Whitmore had learned that guilty men often betrayed themselves when confronted with confident accusations, their own consciences becoming their worst enemies. Ashworth proved no exception. "You can't prove anything," he said, and the words were as good as a confession. "Whatever Marcus told you, he's lying. I never touched those girls. I was here working my shift. Ask anyone." "We will," Whitmore interrupted. "But first, why don't you tell us where Dr. Pemberton is hiding? Cooperation now might make things easier for you later." Ashworth's composure cracked completely. The thin veneer of medical respectability fell away to reveal something ugly and desperate beneath, like stripping paint from rotten wood. "He's gone," he whispered. "Said he was going abroad, somewhere they couldn't extradite him. Said if I kept my mouth shut, no one would ever connect me to what happened." "But he was wrong about that, wasn't he?" Whitmore said quietly. "We know about your history together at St. Bartholomew's. We know about the pattern of behavior that got him dismissed and had you transferred. And we know that 2 innocent girls are dead because you and Pemberton couldn't control your sick urges." The interrogation that followed took place in the stark confines of a metropolitan police interview room, where the green-painted walls and single bare bulb created an atmosphere of inescapable truth. Ashworth, faced with the mounting evidence and the certainty of his exposure, began to crack like ice under pressure. The story that emerged was more horrifying than even Whitmore had imagined. Pemberton and Ashworth had met at medical school in the 1930s, bonding over shared proclivities that both men had learned to hide behind their professional facades. Their collaboration had begun at Bartholomew's, where they had systematically preyed on vulnerable female patients, using their medical authority to commit acts that would have sent them to prison if discovered. The dismissal from Bart's had been a warning rather than an ending. Pemberton had moved to Coventry, Ashworth to London, but they had maintained contact, sharing fantasies and planning opportunities. The Willowbrook murders had been the culmination of years of preparation, a carefully orchestrated hunt that had gone exactly according to plan until the investigation began closing in. "We watched them for days," Ashworth confessed, his voice hollow with defeat. "Marcus spotted them at the market, said they were perfect, young, naive, trusting. We planned it all out. Marcus would approach them on the towpath while I came from the other direction, cutting off their escape. The chloral hydrate in the sweets was Marcus's idea. Said it would make them compliant without causing suspicion." Whitmore felt sick listening to the clinical detachment with which Ashworth described the assault and murder of 2 innocent girls. "And after you killed them, we weighted the bodies with stones and dropped them in the deepest part of the canal. Marcus was certain they'd never be found. He said the current would carry them miles downstream, and by the time anyone thought to look, we'd be long gone. But you didn't leave," Whitmore observed. "You came back to London and continued working as if nothing had happened." Ashworth's laugh was bitter and self-mocking. "Marcus said it would look suspicious if we both disappeared at the same time. Better for one of us to maintain normal routines while the other escaped. I was supposed to follow him abroad in a few months, once the investigation died down." The final piece of the puzzle fell into place with sickening clarity. "Where is Pemberton now?" "I don't know," Ashworth insisted. "He said he was going to Paris, maybe Spain, somewhere warm where British police couldn't touch him. He has money saved, false papers. Said he'd contact me when it was safe." But Whitmore suspected that Dr. Marcus Pemberton had no intention of contacting his accomplice ever again. Men like Pemberton didn't share. They used people and discarded them when they became liabilities. Ashworth had been left behind not as part of a plan, but as a sacrifice to protect the real monster's escape. The manhunt for Pemberton intensified, spreading across Europe through Interpol channels and diplomatic contacts. His photograph was circulated to border controls from Calais to Gibraltar, his description broadcast to police forces from Madrid to Rome. But as the days passed without result, Whitmore began to suspect that they were chasing a ghost. It was Detective Sergeant Moore, once again demonstrating her exceptional investigative instincts, who discovered the truth that had eluded everyone else. "Inspector," she called from Willowbrook, as Whitmore prepared to return from London empty-handed. "I think we've been looking in the wrong direction entirely. I've been going through Pemberton's financial records again, and I found something we missed." "What is it?" "He didn't just empty his bank account Friday afternoon. He also withdrew a substantial sum from a building society account that we didn't know existed. But here's the interesting part. The withdrawal was made not in Coventry or Birmingham, but in Dover. Friday evening, just before the banks closed." Whitmore felt his pulse quicken. "Dover, the ferry port." "Exactly. But Inspector, I checked the passenger manifests for all ferries departing Dover that weekend. There's no record of anyone matching Pemberton's description or using his name." "False papers," Whitmore suggested. "He could have traveled under any identity." "That's what I thought too," Moore continued. "But then I had another idea. What if he never intended to leave England at all? What if the Dover trip was misdirection, designed to make us think he'd fled abroad while he actually went to ground somewhere in Britain?" The possibility had never occurred to Whitmore, but as he considered it, the logic became undeniable. Pemberton was a psychiatrist, a man who understood the criminal mind better than most. He would know that police resources would be concentrated on international searches, leaving domestic hiding places relatively unmonitored. Whitmore said slowly, "You may have just cracked this case wide open. What else did you find?" "I cross-referenced property records, looking for anywhere Pemberton might have access to. His family owned a cottage in the Lake District, inherited from his grandmother but never used. It's remote, isolated, perfect for someone who wants to disappear without leaving the country." Within hours, a joint operation between Cumbrian police and Whitmore's team was racing toward the remote cottage nestled in the hills above Windermere. The building sat like a forgotten relic among the sheep pastures, its windows dark and curtained, no smoke rising from its chimney despite the cool evening air. But there were signs of recent habitation, tire tracks in the muddy lane, a car hidden behind the cottage under a tarpaulin, and most tellingly, a thin wisp of smoke emerging not from the main chimney, but from a smaller flue that suggested someone was using only one room to avoid detection. Dr. Marcus Pemberton was arrested without resistance as he sat by a small fire in the cottage's back bedroom, reading a medical journal as if he was simply taking a country holiday. He looked up as the police surrounded him with the same mild interest he might have shown for an unexpected visitor, his pale eyes reflecting the firelight like chips of winter ice. "Gentlemen," he said calmly, setting aside his journal with careful precision, "I rather expected you would find me eventually, though I must admit, you were quicker than I anticipated." The confession that followed was delivered with the clinical detachment of a medical lecture, as if Pemberton were describing a particularly interesting case study rather than admitting to the brutal murder of two innocent girls. He showed no remorse, no recognition of the horror he had inflicted, only a mild annoyance at being interrupted in his reading. "The girls were selected based on psychological profiles," he explained as if discussing laboratory specimens. "Young, trusting, socially naive, the perfect subjects for our research into the intersection of power and vulnerability. Ashworth was a competent assistant, though lacking in imagination." Whitmore had to restrain himself from physically attacking the man as Pemberton continued his obscene recitation of the murders, describing Margaret Hartwell and Penelope Morrison as if they had been test subjects rather than human beings with families who loved them. "Research," Whitmore repeated, his voice tight with controlled fury. "You call the murder of 2 children research?" Pemberton's eyebrows rose slightly, the expression of a professor correcting a student's misconception. "Everything is research, Inspector. Every human interaction is an opportunity to study behavior, to test hypotheses about the nature of power and submission." The girls provided valuable data about fear responses and survival instincts. The trial of Dr. Marcus Pemberton and Dr. James Ashworth began 6 months later in the ancient courthouse of Warwick, where the weight of centuries seemed to press down upon the proceedings, like the accumulated judgment of history. The case had captured the nation's attention, not only for its horrific details but for the shocking revelation that 2 respected medical professionals had used their positions of trust to commit acts of unspeakable evil. Pemberton maintained his calm demeanor throughout the proceedings, answering questions with the same clinical detachment he had shown during his confession. He seemed genuinely puzzled by the emotional reactions of the victims' families, as if their grief were an irrational response to what he considered a natural outcome of scientific inquiry. Ashworth, by contrast, wept throughout most of the trial, his confession having opened floodgates of guilt and self-recrimination that no amount of legal maneuvering could stem. His testimony provided the final pieces of evidence needed to ensure both men's convictions, though his cooperation did nothing to mitigate the horror of their crimes. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning with verdicts of guilty on all charges. Both men were sentenced to death, though in Pemberton's case, the sentence would later be commuted to life imprisonment when Britain abolished capital punishment. Ashworth would die in his cell before the appeals process was completed, found hanging from a bedsheet noose with a note that simply read, "I'm sorry." Pemberton would spend the rest of his life in Broadmoor Criminal Lunatic Asylum, where his medical training made him a valued member of the institution's staff, even as his crimes made him one of its most closely watched inmates. He died in 1973, 20 years after the murders, still maintaining that his actions had been justified in the name of scientific advancement. The families of Margaret Hartwell and Penelope Morrison found what comfort they could in the knowledge that justice had been served, though no legal proceeding could restore their daughters or erase the nightmare that had consumed their lives. Florence Hartwell never fully recovered from her loss, spending her remaining years as a shadow of her former self, while Eleanor Morrison channeled her grief into advocacy work for victims' families, becoming a pioneering voice for support services that continue to help grieving families today. Detective Inspector Whitmore returned to Coventry with his reputation enhanced, but his faith in human nature permanently scarred. The case had shown him depths of evil that he had never imagined possible, and though he would go on to solve many more murders during his career, none would affect him as profoundly as the deaths of 2 teenage girls on a sunny Saturday afternoon in May. The towpath beside the Willowbrook Canal returned to its peaceful existence, though local residents noted that the swans seemed to avoid the area near the abandoned lock, as if some lingering presence disturbed their serene progress through the dark water. A memorial bench was installed near the spot where the girls' bodies were found, bearing a simple inscription, "In memory of Margaret Hartwell and Penelope Morrison, taken too soon but never forgotten." Detective Sergeant Patricia Moore remained in Willowbrook for several more years, eventually being promoted to detective inspector and taking over Whitmore's position when he retired. She never married, dedicating her life to the pursuit of justice for those who could no longer speak for themselves. In her final case report on the Hartwell-Morrison murders, she wrote, "Evil exists in many forms, but perhaps none is more insidious than that which hides behind masks of respectability and professional authority." The victims of Dr. Pemberton and Dr. Ashworth trusted them because society had taught them to trust medical professionals, to respect education and position. Their deaths remind us that evil often comes dressed in the clothes of respectability, and that vigilance is the price of safety in a world where monsters can wear the faces of healers. As the years passed, and the immediate horror of the murders faded from public memory, the case became a cornerstone of criminal psychology studies, cited in textbooks and academic papers, as an example of how collaborative predators operate within professional settings. But for those who lived through the investigation, who walked the towpath and searched the dark water, and looked into the faces of evil masquerading as healing, the lessons learned could never be reduced to academic abstractions. The Willowbrook Canal flows on, its dark waters carrying the memories of tragedy beneath their placid surface. The town has grown and changed. The old mill has closed, the terraced houses have been renovated and modernized. But on quiet Saturday afternoons in May, when the hawthorn blossoms hang heavy in the air, and young people walk hand in hand along the towpath, some residents still pause to remember two girls who never made it home for tea, and the evil that came calling on a day when the whole world should have been beautiful. In the end, the Towpath shadows had given up their secrets, but the scars they left behind would never fully heal. Some stories have no true ending, only the promise that those who remember will never let the victims be forgotten, and that justice, however delayed, will always find its way to the light. The last entry in Detective Inspector Whitmore's case file, written on the day the verdicts were announced, consisted of just 3 words: justice for Margaret, justice for Penelope, justice at last. But in the margins of that final report, in handwriting that grew more shaky with each passing year, someone had added a 4th line: some shadows never fully lift.